Welcome to Sinister States.
My name is Aaron Pike, and I was hired to watch a forest fire tower that no one else wanted anymore. The listing was brief, almost apologetic, like it expected to be ignored. Seasonal lookout, remote location, limited contact, competitive pay. The final line was the one that stuck with me. Follow posted protocols. I found it buried in a government contracting board between snowplow operators and archival clerks. It didn't mention the voices. That came later. I took the job because I needed space. Not the inspirational kind people talk about when they mean a vacation, but the kind that happens when you've been living too close to other people's expectations for too long. I had just left a city apartment that never slept and a relationship that never let me. I told my sister I was going to spend the summer listening to wind in the trees and watching storms roll in. She said it sounded peaceful. I let her believe that. The tower was 3 hours past the last town with a grocery store, up a service road that twisted until my phone gave up entirely. The forest closed in as I climbed, tall and uniform, like it had been planted with intention rather than grown. When I reached the clearing, the tower rose out of it with a familiarity that surprised me, a skeletal structure of steel and wood that looked like it had always belonged there. The cabin sat at the top, square and weathered, with windows on all sides and a narrow wraparound deck. Someone had painted the railings recently. Everything else looked old enough to remember hands. The handover was quick. A man named Collins met me at the base, checked my ID, and handed me a ring of keys heavier than it needed to be. He spoke in short sentences and avoided looking up at the cabin. We went through the basics. Radio checks at the top of every hour. Weather log at dawn and dusk. Visual sweeps every 15 minutes during daylight. Night observation only if conditions warranted. He said that part twice, like he was reminding himself. Then he pointed at a laminated sheet bolted to the inside of the cabin door and told me to read it before nightfall. The rules were written in the same tone as the rest of the paperwork. Clear, neutral, almost boring. Don't leave the tower unattended. Don't descend after dark unless instructed. Don't use personal drones. Don't light fires. Don't answer the radio after midnight unless you recognize the call sign. That last one had a handwritten note beside it, in ink that had faded to the color of dried leaves. If you hear voices outside, do not respond. I asked Collins about it. He said sometimes hikers shouted up for directions. Sometimes kids dared each other to climb the access road at night. He said people got lost and panicked and did strange things. He didn't say anything about why the note was written by hand when everything else was printed. He didn't say why the bolt heads on the sheet were scratched like someone had tried to pry it off before. He told me to have a good season and left before I could think of another question. The first week was exactly what I'd hoped for. Mornings smelled like pine and metal. The tower creaked as it warmed in the sun. I learned the rhythm of the forest, the way birds announced changes before I could see them. I logged clouds, wind, and distant smoke that turned out to be nothing. At night, I cooked on a small propane stove and read by lantern. The radio stayed quiet. The world felt appropriately sized again. The voices didn't start right away. When they did, they were subtle enough that I doubted myself. The first time, it was just after dusk, the light thinning into a blue that made the trees look deeper than they were. I was finishing my log when I heard my name carried up from below, stretched thin by distance. Aaron. It sounded like someone calling from the bottom of a hill, breathless and unsure. I stepped onto the deck without thinking, one hand on the railing, scanning the clearing. There was no one there. The forest was still. I told myself sound traveled strangely in places like this and went back inside. The second time, it came later, past midnight. I was half asleep on the narrow cot when the radio crackled once, then went silent. A few seconds after, the voice came again, closer now, right under the tower. Aaron, can you hear me? It wasn't urgent. It was conversational, like a neighbor leaning over a fence. I sat up, heart ticking faster, and looked at the laminated rules. Don't answer. I stayed quiet until the voice drifted away, syllables dissolving into the trees. By the third night, the voice had learned something new. It sounded like my sister. She used my full name the way she always did when she was pretending not to worry. Aaron Michael, pick up. I pressed my hands against my ears and focused on my breathing until it stopped. In the morning, I wrote a careful note in the log about auditory anomalies and underlined it twice. No one responded. I started noticing other things then. The way the forest went quiet in patches, like sound had been absorbed rather than faded. The way the stairs seemed longer on the way down during daylight checks, each step a fraction too tall. I found footprints near the base of the tower that didn't lead anywhere, impressions in the dirt that ended abruptly, as if whoever made them had stepped off the world. I reported that too. The radio replied with static and a reminder to stay focused. At the end of the second week, a storm rolled in without warning. The sky darkened fast, clouds stacking on each other like they were in a hurry. Wind rattled the windows and made the tower sway. I secured what I could and watched lightning stitch the horizon. When the rain started, it came down hard enough to blur the trees into a single moving mass. That was when the voices multiplied. They came from all directions, overlapping, familiar and wrong. My mother's laugh, cut short. A friend from college asking if I remembered the way home. A man I didn't know telling me I was needed. They didn't shout. They didn't beg. They talked to each other, commented on the weather, wondered aloud if I was comfortable up there. I sat on the floor with my back against the cot and kept my mouth shut until my jaw ached. When the storm passed, something else was left behind. The forest didn't return to normal. The silence lingered, heavy and expectant. I went out onto the deck at first light and saw movement between the trees, just beyond the clearing. Shapes that suggested people without resolving into them. They stayed at the edge of my vision, retreating when I tried to focus. I logged it. I waited. No response came. The protocols didn't tell me what to do when the job itself began to feel like a test. I was failing without knowing the questions. They didn't explain why the voices knew things they shouldn't, or why they were patient. By the time I realized the rules were less about safety and more about restraint, it felt too late to pretend ignorance. I stayed in the tower because it was the only place that still felt defined, the last line someone had drawn and bothered to label. And every night, as the forest breathed and listened, I did the same. By the third week, the schedule began to feel like a superstition. I followed it anyway. I logged the hours. I swept the horizon. I made coffee at the same times. I learned the way the light slid across the floorboards in the afternoon and how the tower sang when the temperature dropped. The radio remained mostly silent, but sometimes it clicked on by itself, a brief hiss like someone clearing their throat. I never answered. I discovered a second set of notes tucked beneath the weather forms in a drawer I hadn't opened before. They were written in different hands, dates spanning years, all variations on the same theme. Heard calling at 2240. Ignored. No incident. Movement below deck at 110. Did not respond. Visual distortion near tree lean. Maintained protocol. One entry was circled so hard the paper tore. Answered once. Won't again. I stopped reading after that. Food started going faster than it should have. I blamed stress and long days until I noticed crumbs on the counter I hadn't left there, and the propane dial turned just enough to be wrong. I reset everything and checked the locks. They were intact. The trapdoor hatch to the stairs was closed and bolted from the inside. Still, I slept lighter, counting breaths and listening for the first syllable of my name. The voices adapted. When they couldn't reach me with familiarity, they tried curiosity. They asked about the view, about the equipment, about what it was like to be alone. They sounded like people who had time. One night, a voice I didn't recognize described the tower to me in detail, the rust on the north beam, The crack in the western window, the loose nail by the cot. It got every detail right. I stayed silent until dawn and then tightened the nail with shaking hands. I tried the radio at noon, breaking my own rule about conserving contact. I asked if anyone else had reported anomalies. The response came back clipped and impersonal. Acknowledged. Maintain protocol. I asked what protocol was for when the anomalies used my voice. The radio went quiet. The silence felt intentional. On the 21st day, I found fresh paint at the base of the tower, a single white line drawn across the dirt like a boundary. It hadn't been there before. I leaned over the railing and called down to ask who'd been there. My mouth closed on the last word. Don't answer. Don't respond. I swallowed the question and watched as the line began to blur, smudged by wind or something moving just beneath the surface. That night, the forest answered for me. It used my voice, perfect and practiced, carrying it up the stairs and onto the deck. "Aaron," it said, softly, like it was checking if I was still there. I pressed my palms to the floor and counted the boards. I focused on the rules, on the shape of the cabin, on the idea that boundaries only worked if someone respected them. When morning came, the white line was gone, and the clearing looked untouched, as if it had never needed marking at all. I realized then that the tower wasn't there to watch for fires. Not really. It was there to be seen, a signal as much as a lookout. Someone had decided long ago that the forest needed a fixed point, a place where a human would stay put and refuse conversation. I understood why the job paid well and why the listing expected to be ignored. It wasn't asking for vigilance. It was asking for silence. I stayed because leaving felt like an answer. I stayed because the rules, minimal as they were, gave me something to hold on to. And I stayed because every time the voices tried my name, and I didn't give it back, the tower held, just a little longer. I wrote all of this down, careful and exact, knowing records mattered. Not for rescue, but for continuity. Someone would come after me. They always did. And when they read my notes, I hoped they would understand why the most important rule was the one that asked nothing at all. Silence was the job, listening the danger. Always. By the time the 4th week began, the tower felt less like a workplace and more like a boundary marker someone had forgotten to remove. The days blurred together, not because nothing happened, but because everything happened in the same careful order. I woke before dawn, logged the weather, brewed coffee, and watched the horizon wake up. I listened to the forest without engaging it, like you might listen to traffic from a closed window. I told myself that as long as I followed the routine would hold. It didn't stop the changes. It just made them easier to notice. The first real sign was the smoke. It appeared to the northeast, a thin gray ribbon rising from a low valley that shouldn't have been burning. I checked the maps, then checked them again. No lightning strikes overnight. No controlled burn scheduled. I logged the coordinates and radioed it in, keeping my voice neutral. The response came back delayed, like the signal had to travel farther than usual. Copy that. Maintain observation. I watched the smoke for hours. It never thickened, never spread. It just hung there, steady and deliberate, as if it were marking a place rather than consuming it. When the wind shifted, the smoke stayed put. I felt the urge to say something to it, to ask what it was doing. I swallowed the words and wrote another note in the log. That night, the voices returned with a new tactic. They spoke to each other about me, just loud enough for me to hear. "He's still up there," one said. "He's doing fine," another replied. They sounded impressed, almost approving. I lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling, counting the nails. When they fell silent, I realized they were waiting. I found the second laminated sheet the next morning. It was bolted to the underside of the deck railing, hidden unless you crouched and looked for it. The plastic was clouded, the corners chipped. The text was short. "If you hear your own voice, do not assume it is you. Do not answer questions you didn't ask. Do not correct inaccuracies. It ended with a line that had been scratched in, deep enough to score the metal beneath. They don't need your permission. They need your attention. I didn't know when it had been added or by whom. The bolts matched the others, worn in the same way. It felt like a message passed hand to hand across time, quiet and urgent. I memorized it and left it where it was. The radio began to misbehave after that. It would turn on without warning, cycling through channels until it landed on one that carried nothing but breathing. Slow, steady, patient. I turned it off every time, fingers careful not to linger on the dial. Once, it came back on by itself a few minutes later, louder than before. I unplugged it from the wall and set it on the floor. The breathing continued, faint but present, like someone standing just outside the cabin door, but I considered leaving then. The thought came fully formed, practical and tempting. I could descend in daylight, drive until my phone found a signal, explain that something was wrong. But the idea of speaking about it felt like breaking a seal. The rules hadn't said, don't leave. They'd said, don't answer, don't respond, don't engage. Leaving felt like engagement of another kind, an admission that the forest had asked a question and I'd chosen to answer with movement instead of sound. I stayed. The smoke disappeared on the 5th day of the 4th week, replaced by a patch of forest that looked subtly rearranged. Trees stood where there hadn't been trees before, trunks spaced too evenly, branches bending at similar angles. I checked old photos I'd taken from the deck. The difference was small but undeniable. The forest was editing itself. That afternoon, I found a notebook I didn't recognize tucked behind the water tank. The cover was soft with age, the pages filled with tight handwriting that shifted styles every few entries. Dates stretched back decades. Names repeated. Some were crossed out. Others were underlined. Each entry described the same job in slightly different words. Watching, listening, not responding. One writer mentioned voices that came from the ground itself, vibrating up through the metal stairs. Another wrote about seeing lights moving between the trees, counting steps. A third described answering once, just once, because the voice sounded like his son. The last entry was short. If you're reading this, you already know. Don't make it easier for them. Keep the tower loud and yourself quiet. I returned the notebook to its place and washed my hands until they felt numb. The water tasted faintly metallic, like it had picked something up on the way up. I switched to bottled water and made a note to report the change. I didn't. The forest tested boundaries more directly after that. Branches scraped the stairs at night, slow and deliberate. Something heavy leaned against the lower supports, making the whole structure groan. I stayed inside, lights low, eyes on the rules. When dawn came, the marks were gone, the ground smooth as if nothing had passed through it. On the 28th day, a hiker appeared in the clearing that he stood just beyond where the grass gave way to dirt, hands raised, face tilted up toward the cabin. He looked ordinary, middle-aged, sunburned, backpack slung over one shoulder. He waved when he saw me. I froze at the window, heart hammering. He called out, asking for directions, for water, for help. His voice echoed correctly, bouncing the way voices should in open air. I didn't respond. He waited for a long time, long enough that my legs began to ache from standing still. When he lowered his hands, his expression shifted from hopeful to puzzled. He tried again, louder this time, using my name. He got it right. I stepped back from the window. When he finally left, he didn't walk away. He walked backward into the trees, eyes fixed on the tower, smiling like he'd learned something useful. That night, the voices were gentle. They told me I'd done well. They said I was helping more than I knew. They said the forest appreciated consistency. I pressed my face into the pillow and waited for sleep to take me somewhere else. The next morning, a new message crackled over the radio. Relief crew delayed. Weather interference. Maintain position. I acknowledged receipt without speaking, thumb pressing the transmit button and releasing it again. The breathing returned, satisfied. I began to understand then that the tower wasn't just a boundary. It was a lesson, a demonstration. As long as someone stayed and refused to answer, the forest had to work harder. It had to shape itself around a silence it couldn't fill. That effort kept it occupied, contained. The job wasn't to watch. It was to withhold that I wrote everything down, careful with my words, precise with my times. I imagined someone else reading it, feeling the same slow dread, the same temptation to respond. I hoped the records would be enough to keep them quiet too. On the 30th day, the voices stopped all at once. The forest exhaled, and for the first time since I'd arrived, it felt empty. I stood on the deck and listened to nothing. The silence felt like a held breath, not peace. I went back inside and waited, knowing better than to trust a pause. The silence lasted 3 days, not the ordinary quiet of wind and distance, but a true absence, like the forest had stepped back just enough to see what I would do without it pressing in. Birds returned cautiously. Insects resumed their low, constant whine. Even the tower sounded different, less strained, its metal joints settling instead of complaining. I followed the routine more carefully than ever, afraid that any deviation would invite attention back too quickly. On the second night of the silence, I slept through until morning for the first time since arriving. No dreams, no voices, no radio clicks. I woke disoriented, heart racing, convinced I'd missed something important. The logs were clean, the horizon clear. Nothing burned, nothing moved. I told myself this was what success looked like. That was when the tower phone rang. It wasn't part of the equipment inventory. There was no phone listed in the manual, no number assigned to the tower. I hadn't noticed it before because it was mounted low on the wall near the stairs, beige plastic faded almost to gray, the kind of thing that blended into the background of government buildings. The ring was soft but insistent, a sound that cut through the quiet like a blade. I stared at it until the ringing stopped. A minute later, it rang again. The rules didn't mention phones. They talked about radios, voices outside, voices on the wind. Nothing about something that waited politely on a hook. I stood very still and counted to 20. The ringing stopped. I exhaled and stepped away. 18 noon. I found a new entry in the logbook. It was written in my handwriting. The timestamp was accurate. The weather notes were correct. The observation section described a flock of birds I'd watched pass over an hour earlier. At the bottom, where I usually sign my name, there was only a single word: present. I tore the page out and burned it in the sink with a match from the emergency kit. The smoke curled thick and black, smelling like old paper and sap. I opened every window until the air cleared, then logged the incident in a fresh book, my hand shaking enough that the letters slanted downhill. The phone rang again that evening, just as the sun dipped below the tree-line. I stayed on the opposite side of the cabin, back pressed to the wall, eyes fixed on the laminated rules. The ringing went on longer this time, steady and patient. When it finally stopped, a voice spoke from the hallway below, carried up the stairs with careful enunciation. "Aaron Pike, seasonal lookout. You are needed at the base." It wasn't asking that I didn't respond. The footsteps came next. Slow, deliberate steps on metal, weight shifting as if whoever was climbing understood the structure perfectly. The stairs creaked in familiar places, the sounds aligning exactly with where they should be. I held my breath as the steps reached the landing below the trapdoor. The latch rattled once, testing. Then everything stopped. I waited until morning to move. When I opened the trapdoor, the stairs were empty. No marks, no sign of anyone having climbed them. At the base of the tower, something had been arranged in the dirt. Sticks, stones, and pine cones laid out in a rough circle, careful and symmetrical. In the center sat the beige phone handset, its cord severed cleanly. I left it there. The silence didn't return after that. The forest grew busy again, sounds layered and restless. The voices came back too, But they were different now. Focused. They stopped pretending to be people I loved. They spoke as a group, overlapping just enough to be disorienting. They talked about procedures, about efficiency, about how much simpler it would be if I just confirmed receipt. On the 35th day, a helicopter passed overhead without landing. It circled the tower twice, low enough that the windows rattled, then banked away toward the south. The radio stayed silent. I waved anyway, a reflex I immediately regretted. That night, the voices laughed. Not mockingly, relieved that I began to feel watched from inside the cabin. Not by eyes, but by attention, like a weight shifting from corner to corner. Objects moved when I wasn't looking. The notebook behind the water tank reappeared on the table, opened to a blank page. A pen lay beside it, uncapped. I closed the book and put it back. In the morning, it was there again, a single word written in careful block letters. Answer. I burned that page too. The forest escalated. The hiker returned, standing closer this time, his face slack and empty. He didn't speak. He just waited, eyes tracking the windows as I moved past them. When night fell, he didn't leave. He stood until dawn, then stepped backward into the trees again, never turning around. The rules began to make a different kind of sense. They weren't about preventing harm. They were about delaying a process that would happen eventually if given enough data. Every answer, every correction, every acknowledgement was a piece of information the forest could use to refine itself. Silence starved it. Not completely, but enough to keep it from finishing whatever it was building. On the 40th day, the phone rang one last time. I didn't look at it. I didn't move. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and focused on the sound of my own breathing. The ringing stopped. The radio crackled to life, cycling channels until it found one that carried my voice. It said my name. I stayed quiet. There was a pause, longer than any before. Then the radio clicked off. The phone went dead. The forest exhaled in a way that felt final, like something giving up for now rather than retreating. At dawn, a truck climbed the service road. Two people got out, both wearing uniforms I recognized from the notebooks. They didn't look at the tower as they approached. One handed me a clipboard. Seasonal term complete. Thank you for your service. The other collected the keys. They asked no questions. I gave no answers. As they drove away, I noticed fresh paint at the base of the tower. A single white line, clean and bright, drawn across the dirt. I didn't cross it. I stayed in the tower for the rest of the morning. Even after the truck disappeared down the service road and the sound of its engine faded into the trees. There was no instruction telling me to leave immediately, no formal handoff, no ceremony to mark the end of anything. The clipboard had already been taken back. As far as the system was concerned, I was finished. The tower, however, felt unchanged. It still hummed softly in the wind. It still waited. I packed slowly, not because there was much to take, but because haste felt like a response, and I had learned better than to offer one. I folded my clothes, wiped down the counter, and closed the logbooks for the last time. I added a final entry, careful with every word, noting only the date, the weather, and that the position was vacated without incident. I didn't mention the voices. I didn't mention the phone. Anyone who needed to know would already understand what wasn't written. Before I left, I stood in the center of the cabin and listened. The forest made its usual sounds now, distant and layered, like a recording played at the correct volume. No one called my name. No one tested the silence. I didn't know whether that meant the lesson had been learned or simply postponed. The walk down the stairs felt longer than it ever had, each step deliberate. At the base, the white line still marked the dirt, clean and precise. Up close, I could see that it wasn't paint at all, but ash, ground fine and laid carefully, as if someone had taken time with it. I stepped over it without looking back. The drive out took less time than the drive in. The forest thinned gradually, trees giving way to scrub, then to open road. My phone regained a signal all at once, notifications flooding in like they'd been waiting. I didn't check them. I kept my eyes on the road and my hands steady on the wheel. When I reached the first town, nothing felt different. People moved through their routines, unaware of the boundary I'd just crossed or the one that still existed behind me. I checked into a motel for the night and slept with the lights on, not because I was afraid of the dark, but because I wanted to remind myself I could choose illumination now. No voices came. No phones rang. In the weeks that followed, life resumed in small, careful ways. I found another job, this one loud and crowded and entirely ordinary. I talked to my sister more. I told her the tower was quiet and left it at that. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I still catch myself listening too closely, waiting for something to address me directly. Old habits don't vanish. They just go dormant. I haven't returned to the forest. I don't need to. The lesson wasn't about the place. It was about attention, about how easily we give it away and how rarely we consider the cost. There are things in this world that don't need belief to exist. They only need acknowledgement, a reply, a moment of engagement. Silence, it turns out, is one of the few boundaries that still works. If you're hearing this because you stayed until the end, I want to thank you for listening the right way. Not by answering back, not by reaching out into the dark, but by holding the story where it belongs and letting it pass without response. That matters more than you think. And if you ever find yourself somewhere remote, somewhere quiet, with rules that seem strangely specific, read them carefully. Follow them even when they don't make sense yet. Especially then. Some jobs aren't about what you do, but about what you refuse to give. Thank you for staying with me. Thank you for your patience and for your silence when it counted. Take care of yourselves, and remember, sometimes the safest thing you can do is nothing at all.